Welcome, gentle dreamers, to the sanctuary of mysteries yet unraveled, where questions drift like evening mist through the corridors of our beloved Hawkins. Tonight, we journey through the unanswered riddles that shimmer in the spaces between knowing and wondering, each mystery a soft lullaby that carries us deeper into peaceful contemplation. Let the trailer's secrets unfold like whispered bedtime stories, each revelation more soothing than the last, as we discover that sometimes the most beautiful part of any tale lies not in its answers, but in the gentle uncertainty that allows our hearts to dream of infinite possibilities. The ancient horror that would reveal itself as the true architect of Hawkins's supernatural nightmare began its existence in the primordial darkness of Dimension X, a realm where thought became reality and hunger could reshape entire universes according to the twisted desires of beings whose understanding of existence transcended the simple concepts of life and death that governed smaller, more fragile worlds, like our own peaceful Earth. The Mind Flayer, as it would come to be known through the innocent terminology of children's games, possessed consciousness that stretched across eons of cosmic time, its awareness encompassing knowledge of countless dimensions where civilizations had risen and fallen according to patterns that it had observed with the patient attention of a predator that understood the value of watching and waiting until circumstances aligned perfectly for consumption that would leave nothing behind except the empty shells of worlds that had once teemed with life and possibility. The interdimensional pathways that connected realm to realm served as highways for this ancient intelligence, its ability to move between layers of reality limited only by the natural barriers that separated dimensions until those barriers were weakened by scientific experiments conducted by beings who lacked sufficient understanding of the forces they were attempting to harness through technology that seemed advanced to them, but represented merely primitive scratching at the surface of mysteries that required eons of development to comprehend safely. The Philadelphia experiment that would ultimately provide the Mind Flayer with its point of entry into our dimension represented humanity's first serious attempt at manipulating the fundamental forces that govern spatial relationships, the military's desire to achieve teleportation, creating resonances that echoed across dimensional boundaries in ways that scientists could never have predicted when they initiated procedures that seemed contained within earthly laboratories but actually sent ripples of disturbance throughout the cosmic web that connected all possible realities. Young Henry Creel's presence in those Nevada caves during the precise moment when dimensional barriers were at their weakest represented the kind of cosmic coincidence that suggested either tremendous misfortune or the guiding hand of fate arranging circumstances according to patterns too complex for human intelligence to recognize. His innocent exploration of underground spaces that seemed like simple childhood adventure, actually placing him at the intersection of forces that would transform not only his individual destiny, but the fate of everyone he would encounter throughout the remainder of his existence. The 12 hours that Henry spent trapped in Dimension X, while his frantic family searched the caves above ground, marked the period when the Mind Flayer first encountered human consciousness and recognized the potential that existed within. Beings whose psychic capabilities could be enhanced and directed according to purposes that served the ancient entity's hunger for expansion into dimensions that offered fresh sources of energy and experience to feed appetites that could never be satisfied through conventional means. The process by which the Mind Flayer claimed Henry as its vessel proceeded with the methodical patience of a predator that understood the importance of preparation when attempting to inhabit consciousness that had developed according to patterns foreign to its own understanding. the gradual integration of alien intelligence with human awareness, requiring careful calibration to ensure that the boy would retain sufficient individual identity to function effectively within human society, while becoming increasingly responsive to guidance that originated from sources beyond his conscious comprehension. The blood type change that doctors would later discover in Henry represented just the surface evidence of transformations that occurred on cellular and spiritual levels throughout his being. The Mind Flayer's influence rewiring not only his physical form but his fundamental relationship with reality in ways that granted him access to abilities that humans were never meant to possess, while simultaneously making him dependent upon continued connection to the entity that had granted such gifts at prices that would not become apparent until much later. The artistic sensitivity that had characterized Henry's childhood personality before his disappearance became the foundation upon which the Mind Flayer constructed its human interface. The boy's natural creativity and emotional intelligence, providing psychological architecture that could support the complex mental processes required for interdimensional manipulation, while maintaining enough of his original nature to prevent complete dissolution of individual identity that might have rendered him useless as a tool for achieving objectives that required subtle manipulation rather than overwhelming force. The family's move from Nevada to Hawkins following Henry's return reflected their desperate attempt to escape the inexplicable changes that had transformed their beloved son into someone whose behavior patterns suggested influences that extended beyond normal psychological development. Their hope that change of environment might restore his original nature, demonstrating the tragic inability of loving parents to comprehend forces that existed so far outside conventional human experience that no amount of care or professional consultation could address problems that originated in cosmic rather than terrestrial sources. Dr. Martin Brenner's discovery of Henry's transformed state represented the convergence of scientific ambition with supernatural opportunity that would ultimately doom dozens of innocent children to lives of experimentation and suffering. His recognition of the boy's psychic abilities triggering research programs that would attempt to replicate and weaponize phenomena that were never meant to be understood through purely materialistic approaches that ignored the spiritual dimensions of powers that originated in realms where consciousness and reality maintained relationships that earthly physics could never adequately describe or predict. The blood samples that Brenner extracted from Henry provided the biological foundation for creating the numbered children whose tragic stories would unfold throughout decades of illegal experimentation, each child representing an attempt to artificially reproduce abilities that had emerged naturally through Henry's contact with interdimensional forces, though the synthetic nature of their powers meant that none of them could achieve the same level of connection with cosmic energies that made their unwilling template so uniquely valuable to the Mind Flayer's long-term objectives. The laboratory facility that Brenner constructed to house and study his psychic subjects became an earthly reflection of the Mind Flayer's own realm, its sterile corridors and controlled environment, creating conditions that facilitated the ancient entity's gradual expansion of influence into our dimension, through the children whose enhanced abilities served as conduits for energies that slowly weakened the barriers between worlds, while providing the Mind Flayer with increasing awareness of human society and its vulnerabilities. The Rainbow Room, where the numbered children spent their recreational hours, represented Brenner's attempt to create artificial family environment that might provide psychological stability necessary for optimal performance during experimental sessions, though the manufactured warmth of this controlled setting could never replace the authentic love and security that had been stolen from children who deserved normal childhoods filled with genuine affection rather than clinical observation. and manipulation disguised as paternal care. The gradual revelation that every supernatural event in Hawkins' history could be traced back to the Mind Flayer's influence through its primary vessel, Henry, demonstrated the true scope of the conspiracy that had unfolded across multiple seasons, each apparent victory against the forces of darkness, actually representing another step in a larger plan that used humanity's natural, protective instincts and heroic impulses to achieve objectives that served the ancient entity's ultimate goal of consuming our entire dimension through carefully orchestrated stages that appeared random but actually followed patterns of infiltration that had been perfected through countless previous conquests. The understanding that Vecna himself was merely a puppet dancing to music composed by intelligences that existed beyond human comprehension transformed the entire narrative from simple good versus evil into complex exploration of how corruption could spread through even the most innocent hearts when exposed to influences that operated according to moral frameworks so alien that human concepts of right and wrong became meaningless distinctions in the face of cosmic appetites that recognized no boundaries except those imposed by insufficient power to overcome resistance. The recognition that the Mind Flayer's true goal extended far beyond simply invading our world to encompass the systematic consumption of all reality represented the ultimate revelation that placed every previous crisis in proper perspective. The battles that had seemed so important to our heroes, actually serving as preliminary exercises designed to test human resistance, while gathering information about the most effective approaches for achieving total victory that would leave nothing behind, except empty space where infinite dimensions had once contained countless civilizations whose stories would be forgotten in the silence that followed successful predation. The cosmic patience that allowed the Mind Flayer to work through decades of apparent setbacks while actually advancing its agenda demonstrated intelligence that operated according to temporal frameworks that made human concepts of urgency and immediate gratification seem like the brief flickers of mayflies, whose entire existence passed unnoticed by entities whose consciousness encompassed eons of experience with patterns that repeated across dimensions in cycles, too vast for individual minds to comprehend without losing sanity in contemplation of infinities that stretched beyond all possibility of human understanding or resistance. The revelation that what our heroes had always understood as the upside down represented merely the outermost layer of a far more complex interdimensional architecture began to unfold like the pages of an ancient book whose true contents had remained hidden beneath surface illustrations that told only the simplest version of a story whose depths extended into realms of cosmic geography that human minds were never designed to navigate without losing themselves in the infinite complexity of spaces that existed between the familiar boundaries of home and the unimaginable territories where ancient hungers prowled through dimensions that served as hunting grounds for entities whose appetites could reshape entire universes according to their twisted desires for consumption and control. The upside down that Will Byers had described during those terrifying days following his return from apparent death carried within his innocent words the key to understanding mysteries that even the most brilliant scientists had failed to comprehend despite years of study and experimentation that had cost countless lives while barely scratching the surface of truths that required not intellectual analysis, but spiritual intuition to grasp the fundamental differences between worlds that appeared similar but actually served completely different functions in the cosmic ecosystem that connected all possible forms of existence through pathways that operated according to laws that transcended human understanding of physics and reality. The description that Will had offered of being stuck between things during those dark months when his connection to the shadow realm manifested through episodes that terrified his mother and confused his doctors contained profound wisdom about the nature of interdimensional space that existed in the gaps between fully realized worlds. His experience as an unwilling traveler through territories that served as buffer zones between dimensions, providing him with knowledge that no earthly education could have taught about the ways that reality was structured in layers that most people never suspected existed beneath the comfortable illusion of singular, stable existence. The bubble world concept that emerged from careful analysis of Will's testimony and the physical evidence gathered during multiple expeditions into the shadow realm revealed that what everyone had assumed was an alternate version of Hawkins actually functioned as a kind of cosmic waiting room, where matter and energy from our dimension could be stored and manipulated while serving the larger purposes of entities whose plans required staging areas where materials could be prepared and organized before being transported to their ultimate destinations in realms that existed so far beyond human experience that direct contact would have instantly annihilated any consciousness that attempted such travel without proper preparation and protection. The dark reflection of Hawkins that had provided the setting for so many terrifying encounters actually represented a kind of three-dimensional photograph that had been created by forces that needed familiar environments where human subjects could be observed and tested without the complications that might arise from exposure to completely alien landscapes that could drive ordinary minds into madness simply through the overwhelming sensory input that characterized regions where reality operated according to principles that bore no resemblance to the comforting predictability of earthly existence governed by natural laws that provided stability and comprehensibility. Dimension X, the true realm from which the Mind Flayer originated and to which it desperately sought to return while bringing the entire Earth dimension as tribute to appetites that could never be satisfied through conventional consumption, existed in cosmic territories that were separated from our reality by barriers so fundamental that crossing between them required not merely advanced technology but complete transformation of consciousness and physical form that would render the traveler unrecognizable to anyone who had known them in their original state of being. The ancient intelligence that ruled Dimension X had developed over eons of existence in environments where thought became matter and desire could reshape the basic structure of reality according to whims that recognized no moral constraints or ethical limitations. Its consciousness, having evolved in spaces where individual identity was meaningless and collective experience flowed together in patterns that created unity through absorption rather than cooperation, making it fundamentally incompatible with forms of life that depended upon maintaining distinct boundaries between self and other. The cosmic hunger that drove the Mind Flayer to seek expansion into new dimensions reflected not simple greed or malicious intent, but a biological imperative that had been hardwired into its essential nature through millions of years of evolution in realms where survival depended upon the ability to consume entire worlds and transform their energy into forms that could be integrated into ever-expanding networks of consciousness that grew stronger through addition of new territories and the absorption of civilizations that had developed unique forms of awareness and creativity. The journey between dimensions required navigation through spaces that existed in the gaps between fully formed realities, territories where the normal rules of cause and effect became fluid and malleable, where time could flow backward or sideways or split into multiple streams that created infinite possibilities for confusion and disorientation among travelers who lacked the cosmic perspective necessary to understand that linear progression from point A to point B represented merely one of countless possible relationships that could exist between locations that were not actually separate but rather different aspects of unified systems, too complex for individual minds to comprehend without losing their sanity. The staging areas that connected our dimension to Dimension X served multiple purposes in the Mind Flayer's long-term strategy for conquest and consumption, providing not only temporary storage space for materials and energy that were being prepared for transport, but also testing grounds where the ancient entity could experiment with different approaches to manipulating matter and consciousness without risking exposure of its true nature or capabilities to potential victims who might develop effective resistance if they understood the full scope of the threat that was gradually surrounding and infiltrating their reality. The membrane-like barriers that separated the bubble world of the Upside Down from both our dimension and Dimension X possessed properties that allowed controlled passage of specific forms of energy and matter while maintaining enough structural integrity to prevent catastrophic merging that might have destroyed all three realms through the kind of cosmic collision that had eliminated countless civilizations throughout the history of interdimensional warfare that had raged across the universe for longer than human minds could conceive of temporal duration measured in scales that made earthly history seem like the briefest flicker of momentary existence. The scientific instruments that Hawkins National Laboratory had developed for studying interdimensional phenomena possessed neither the sensitivity nor the conceptual framework necessary for detecting the subtle differences between realms that appeared similar but actually served completely different functions in the cosmic architecture that the Mind Flayer had constructed over centuries of patient preparation for the final phase of its conquest. Their measurements and calculations, producing data that seemed to confirm simple theories about alternate worlds while completely missing the evidence of complex, multi-layered reality that existed all around them. The portal technology that had been developed through decades of experimentation and countless human sacrifices actually functioned by creating temporary weakness in the barriers between dimensions, rather than opening genuine doorways that would allow free travel between realms. The fleeting connections that resulted from such efforts providing just enough contact to permit limited exchange of matter and energy, while preventing the kind of complete merger that would have immediately alerted the Mind Flayer to humanity's primitive attempts at interdimensional manipulation that might have triggered accelerated invasion rather than the gradual infiltration that served the ancient entity's preferences for subtle conquest over dramatic confrontation. The geography of interdimensional space followed patterns that reflected not random distribution of cosmic territories, but careful organization that had been imposed over eons by intelligences that understood the strategic value of controlling access routes between realms and maintaining supply, lines that could support extended military campaigns across distances that were measured not in miles or light years, but in degrees of reality distortion that required completely different mathematics to calculate accurately. The way stations that existed between major dimensional territories served as rest stops and communication centers for entities that traveled regularly between realms on business that involved commerce in forms of energy and consciousness that earthly languages possessed no words to describe adequately. Their functions similar to the trading posts that had once connected distant cities along ancient caravan routes, except that the goods being exchanged included entire civilizations, and the currency consisted of refined suffering and processed hope that had been extracted from conquered worlds through methods that defied human understanding of economics and value. The navigational systems that guided travel through interdimensional space operated according to principles that combined advanced mathematics with mystical intuition in ways that required not only technical knowledge but spiritual, development that allowed travelers to sense the subtle currents and gravitational fields that shape the flow of matter and energy between dimensions. The most skilled navigators possessing abilities that bordered on prophecy, as they learned to predict changes in cosmic weather patterns that could strand unwary voyagers in territories where time moved differently or reality followed. Rules that made survival impossible for beings who had evolved under different conditions. The defense mechanisms that protected stable dimensions from unwanted intrusion included both natural barriers that had formed through cosmic evolution and artificial fortifications that had been constructed by civilizations that had developed sufficient understanding of interdimensional warfare to recognize the importance of maintaining secure boundaries around their territories, though the effectiveness of such protections depended ultimately upon the continued vigilance of guardians who understood that eternal watchfulness represented the price of freedom from cosmic predators that prowled the spaces between worlds in search of vulnerable targets. The revelation that everything the heroes of Hawkins had experienced during their battles against supernatural forces represented merely the preliminary stages of a much larger conflict that would ultimately determine the fate of not only their world, but countless other dimensions created. Perspective that transformed their understanding of their own importance from simple local crisis to cosmic significance that placed enormous responsibility upon young shoulders that had already carried burdens far beyond what anyone their age should have been asked to bear in service of protecting innocents who remained unaware of the dangers that surrounded them. The 12 hours that vanished from young Henry Creel's life, like pages torn from a diary that no one would ever be permitted to read, contained within their missing moments the transformation of an innocent child into something that existed at the intersection of human consciousness and cosmic horror. Those lost fragments of time serving as the crucible where a boy who had once drawn pictures of butterflies and collected fallen leaves for art projects became the unwilling vessel for an ancient intelligence whose hunger for conquest had waited eons for exactly the right combination of circumstances and vulnerability that would allow it to establish its first foothold in our unsuspecting dimension. The Nevada caves where Henry had wandered during what should have been nothing more than a routine family camping trip possessed geological properties that made them natural conduits for interdimensional energy, their limestone formations and mineral deposits creating crystalline structures that resonated with frequencies that existed just beyond the range of human perception, but fell perfectly within the vibrational patterns that governed communication between realms, where matter and consciousness followed rules that bore no resemblance to the comfortable predictability of earthly physics that most people accepted as the complete description of reality. The Philadelphia experiment that had been conducted hundreds of miles away from Henry's location created ripple effects that propagated through interdimensional space like stones thrown into a cosmic pond. The military's attempts at teleportation technology, generating resonance patterns that weakened the barriers between worlds at precisely the moment when a curious 10-year-old boy was exploring underground passages that happened to align with rift points where multiple dimensions converged in configurations that occurred perhaps once in a millennium under normal circumstances, but had been artificially triggered by human experimentation that possessed no understanding of the forces being manipulated. The moment of dimensional breach that pulled Henry from our world into Dimension X occurred with the subtle inevitability of a soap bubble bursting, his passage between realms feeling to his young consciousness like stepping through a doorway that had always existed, but had somehow remained invisible until that precise instant when cosmic forces aligned to create an opening that would remain available for only the briefest fraction of time, before natural repair mechanisms began the process of sealing the wound that had been torn in the fabric of reality itself. The landscape that greeted Henry upon his arrival in Dimension X bore superficial resemblance to the cave system he had been exploring, though careful observation would have revealed that the rock formations possessed geometric properties that defied earthly understanding of how stone could be shaped by natural processes. Their surfaces covered with patterns that seemed to shift and flow when viewed directly, but returned to static configurations whenever his attention was directed elsewhere, creating the unsettling impression that the environment itself was watching him with intelligence that possessed both curiosity and hunger. The Mind Flayer's first contact with human consciousness proceeded with the patient methodology of a scientist studying a fascinating new specimen. Its initial approaches to Henry's mind, following protocols that had been developed through eons of experience, with absorbing and integrating the awareness of countless other species whose unique perspectives had been added to the Pobli Fay, collective intelligence that had grown stronger and more sophisticated with each successful conquest, while retaining enough individual memory fragments to understand how different forms of consciousness could be manipulated most effectively. The process by which the ancient entity began its inhabitation of Henry's young mind resembled nothing so much as a master musician learning to play a new and incredibly complex instrument, its alien intelligence carefully mapping the neural pathways and emotional responses that governed human thought, while simultaneously beginning the delicate work of introducing its own patterns of awareness into systems that had evolved according to completely different principles and operational requirements than those that characterized the hive mind collective that represented its natural state of being. The gradual erosion of Henry's individual identity proceeded through stages that were calibrated to prevent the kind of traumatic rejection that might have destroyed the host consciousness before integration could be completed. The Mind Flayer's influence, spreading through his thoughts and memories, like ink dissolving in water, coloring every aspect of his personality, while leaving enough of his original nature intact to maintain the illusion of continuity that would be necessary for successful operation within human society once the possession had been accomplished to the entity's satisfaction. The visions that began flooding Henry's awareness during those lost 12 hours provided him with glimpses of cosmic history that stretched back through eons of interdimensional warfare and conquest, his young mind struggling to process images of civilizations that had risen and fallen according to patterns that revealed the Mind Flayer's preferred methods for identifying and infiltrating target dimensions through the cultivation of local agents who could prepare the ground for eventual invasion while appearing to their fellow beings as normal members of their communities, rather than advanced scouts for cosmic predators. The physical transformations that accompanied Henry's psychological colonization occurred on cellular levels that would not be detectable through conventional medical examination. The Mind Flayer's influence rewriting his genetic code and metabolic processes to create hybrid physiology that could channel interdimensional energies while maintaining enough human characteristics to avoid detection by parents and genetics doctors whose understanding of biology was limited to earthly forms of life that followed predictable patterns of development and aging. The blood type change that would later puzzle medical professionals represented only the most obvious evidence of alterations that had restructured Henry's entire relationship with physical reality, his transformed circulatory system now capable of processing forms of energy that would have been instantly fatal to unmodified human physiology, while his nervous system developed new pathways that could handle the massive data streams required for maintaining contact with consciousness that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The memories of his life before the transformation remained accessible to Henry, but became increasingly difficult to distinguish from implanted experiences that had been designed to modify his emotional responses and behavioral patterns. The Mind Flayer's careful editing of his psychological landscape, ensuring that his natural empathy and creative instincts would gradually be redirected toward purposes that served the ancient entity's agenda, while maintaining enough of his original personality to preserve the appearance of normal human development during the crucial years when any dramatic changes might have attracted unwanted attention. The return journey from Dimension X to our world occurred through the same dimensional weakness that had allowed Henry's initial passage between realms, though the boy who emerged from the caves after 12 hours of frantic searching by his parents bore only superficial resemblance to the child who had disappeared, his physical form unchanged, but his essential nature having been fundamentally altered in ways that would not become apparent until the Mind Flayer judged that sufficient time had passed for the integration to stabilize completely. The family's relief at finding Henry unharmed masked their unconscious recognition that something profound had changed during his absence. Their parental instincts detecting subtle differences in his speech patterns and emotional responses that they attributed to trauma from being lost and afraid, rather than recognizing the signs of possession by an intelligence that had spent eons perfecting the art of inhabiting and controlling the consciousness of other beings, while maintaining enough of their original personalities to prevent detection by those who loved them. The gradual manifestation of Henry's psychic abilities proceeded according to carefully planned stages that allowed him to experiment with his new capabilities while learning to conceal their true scope from family members whose growing concern about his increasingly disturbing behavior patterns eventually prompted their decision to relocate from Nevada to Hawkins in the desperate hope that change of environment might restore their son to the sweet-natured child he had been before his mysterious disappearance in the caves. The artistic pursuits that had once brought Henry innocent joy became vehicles for expressing visions that originated not in human imagination, but in cosmic memories that the Mind Flayer shared with its chosen vessel, his drawings evolving from simple, childish sketches of familiar objects to complex diagrams that depicted interdimensional geography and energy patterns that no earthly education could have taught him to understand or reproduce with the precision that characterized his increasingly sophisticated artwork. The small acts of cruelty that began appearing in Henry's behavior represented the Mind Flayer's systematic testing of its host's capacity for violence and his family's tolerance for aberrant conduct, each incident carefully calibrated to push boundaries while remaining within the range of behaviors that worried parents might excuse as temporary phases or responses to stress, rather than evidence of fundamental changes in moral orientation that reflected the influence of an entity that recognized no ethical constraints or emotional limitations. The move to Hawkins provided Henry with access to new environments and potential victims, while placing him within the geographical range of Dr. Martin Brenner's research activities. This convergence of circumstances reflecting either remarkable coincidence or the Mind Flayer's ability to influence probability patterns in ways that guided events toward outcomes that served its long-term objectives for establishing permanent presence in our dimension through the systematic recruitment and development of human agents who could advance its agenda while appearing to serve their own interests. The discovery of Henry's transformed nature by Brenner represented the culmination of the Mind Flayer's patient preparation for the next phase of its conquest. The scientist's recognition of the boy's psychic potential, providing the ancient entity with access to resources and institutional support that would enable the creation of additional psychic subjects while maintaining the secrecy necessary to prevent premature exposure of the interdimensional invasion that was proceeding according to plans that had been developed through careful study of human psychological and social patterns. The laboratory where Henry would spend his teenage years served as both prison and training facility where the Mind Flayer could continue its development of human psychic capabilities while using its primary vessel to oversee the creation of additional agents whose powers would eventually provide the energy necessary to open stable portals between dimensions and complete the conquest that had begun with one lost boy's innocent exploration of caves that contained doorways to cosmic horror beyond human imagination, or resistance, the grotesque machinery of living flesh and psychic energy that Vecna had constructed within the Shadow Realm represented the culmination of decades of patient preparation and horrific experimentation, its organic components pulsing with the collective anguish of 12 innocent children whose consciousness had been harvested and woven together into a cosmic instrument whose purpose transcended the simple categories of weapon or tool to become something that existed at the intersection of technology and nightmare, a creation that violated every natural law governing the relationship between mind and matter, while serving as the final key that would unlock doorways between dimensions that were never meant to be opened by beings whose understanding of cosmic forces remained trapped within the limited frameworks of earthly science and human ambition. The 12 children whose tortured forms provided the essential components for this abomination had been selected not through random chance or simple availability, but according to precise criteria that reflected the Mind Flayer's sophisticated understanding of how psychic energy could be refined and concentrated through suffering that stripped away individual identity while preserving the essential spark of consciousness that could be redirected toward purposes that served entities whose appetites operated on scales that measured consumption, not in terms of physical matter, but in the complete absorption of entire realities whose existence would be erased from cosmic memory once the ancient intelligence had finished extracting every fragment of useful experience and creative potential. The configuration that arranged the children's suspended bodies within the fleshy architecture of Vecna's creation followed patterns that mirrored the Mind Flayer's own anatomical structure, their positioning carefully calculated to create resonance fields that would amplify their combined psychic output while maintaining the delicate balance necessary to prevent the kind of catastrophic feedback that might have destroyed both the organic machinery and its operators before the portal to Dimension X could be successfully opened and stabilized through the application of energies that had never before been channeled through forms of consciousness that had evolved under earthly conditions. The tendrils that connected each child to the central processing core of the celestial mechanism served multiple functions that extended far beyond simple energy transmission to include data collection systems that monitored their psychological state and vital signs while simultaneously extracting memories and emotional experiences that were being archived for later analysis by the Mind Flayer's consciousness, which had learned through eons of conquest that the most valuable resources offered by conquered civilizations were often found not in their material achievements, but in their unique perspectives on existence and their distinctive approaches to creativity and problem solving. The psychic energy that flowed through the organic circuitry of Vecna's construction possessed qualities that distinguished it from conventional forms of power in ways that made it infinitely more valuable for interdimensional manipulation. The refined suffering and concentrated anguish of the trapped children creating frequencies that could penetrate barriers between realms while carrying information that would allow the Mind Flayer to understand and eventually control aspects of reality that remained beyond the reach of purely technological approaches to cosmic engineering and dimensional warfare. The living walls that surrounded and protected the celestial meat clock pulsed with rhythms that synchronized with the collective heartbeat of the imprisoned children, their biomechanical surfaces covered with nerve clusters that served as monitoring stations where Vecna could observe the flow of energy through systems that had been grown rather than built according to blueprints that originated not in human imagination but in the alien intelligence that had spent millions of years perfecting methods for converting living beings into components of machines whose purposes reflected appetites and ambitions that operated according to moral frameworks so different from human ethics that concepts like cruelty and compassion became meaningless. Distinctions. The exact number 12 that defined the scope of Vecna's collection reflected not arbitrary choice or simple availability, but precise mathematical requirements that had been calculated through the Mind Flayer's analysis of the energy levels necessary to overcome the natural resistance that protected stable dimensions from unwanted intrusion. The combined psychic potential of this specific quantity of enhanced human consciousness, providing exactly the amount of power needed to tear holes in reality that would remain open long enough for interdimensional invasion forces to establish permanent beachheads in conquered territories. The theft of 11's abilities that had occurred during their previous confrontation provided Vecna with additional energy reserves that supplemented, but could not replace the massive power requirements that opening stable portals demanded, his absorption of her psychic strength serving as proof of concept that demonstrated the feasibility of harvesting and redirecting consciousness-based energy while revealing the limitations that made additional sources necessary for achieving objectives that required sustained output over extended periods rather than brief bursts of power that might suffice for smaller-scale manipulations of local reality. The failure of earlier attempts to breach dimensional barriers had taught the Mind Flayer valuable lessons about the instability problems that plagued portals created through insufficient energy input, the collapse of previous gateways serving as expensive education in cosmic engineering that revealed the importance of overwhelming initial resistance through massive power application rather than attempting gradual approaches that allowed natural repair mechanisms to counteract intrusion attempts before they could achieve critical mass necessary for self-sustaining expansion. The wormhole theory that Mr. Clark had enthusiastically explained to his students contained within its simple analogies profound truths about the nature of interdimensional travel that the teacher himself could never have suspected. His educational examples of folded paper and connecting tunnels, describing with remarkable accuracy the basic principles that govern the creation of stable passages between realms whose natural separation required enormous energy, expenditures to overcome through technological intervention rather than the mystical approaches that had been attempted by previous civilizations, whose understanding of cosmic forces had been limited by religious rather than scientific frameworks. The psychic resonance created by the 12 children's synchronized suffering generated harmonic frequencies that could penetrate the quantum foam that filled the spaces between dimensions, their collective anguish serving as both power source and guidance system for energies that needed not only sufficient strength to tear holes in reality, but also precise directional control to ensure that portals opened in the correct cosmic coordinates, rather than random locations that might lead to territories controlled by entities even more dangerous than the Mind Flayer itself. The organic machinery that processed and refined the children's psychic output operated according to biological principles that had been modified through interdimensional influence to create hybrid systems that combined earthly physiology with alien technology in ways that produced capabilities that neither human science nor Mind Flayer engineering could have achieved independently. the resulting biomechanical fusion, creating efficiencies that multiplied the raw power of consciousness-based energy, while adding layers of control and direction that transformed chaotic psychic emanations into precisely focused tools for cosmic manipulation. The neural networks that connected the individual children's consciousness to the collective processing system allowed for real-time adjustment of energy flows and frequency modulation based on changing conditions during the portal opening sequence, their interconnected awareness, creating a distributed intelligence that could respond to unexpected complications while maintaining the delicate balance necessary to prevent system overload that might have destroyed both the organic components and their operators before the interdimensional gateway could be successfully established and secured. The pain amplification systems that had been integrated into every aspect of the celestial meat clock served not only to increase psychic energy output, but also to maintain the psychological conditions necessary for optimal consciousness extraction, the Mind Flayer's research having revealed that certain forms of suffering produced energy signatures that were particularly effective for dimensional manipulation, while other types of distress generated interference patterns that reduced system efficiency and required constant monitoring and adjustment to prevent power fluctuations. The monitoring systems that tracked each child's vital signs and psychological state provided Vecna with real-time data about the performance characteristics of his organic machinery while alerting him to potential system failures before they could cascade into complete breakdown of the portal generation process. His intimate knowledge of human physiology and psychology, allowing him to maintain each component at optimal operating levels while extracting maximum energy output without causing premature death that would require time-consuming replacement procedure. The backup systems that had been incorporated into the celestial meat clock's design reflected the Mind Flayer's understanding that interdimensional engineering projects often encountered unexpected complications that could destroy months or years of careful preparation. If adequate, redundancy had not been built into critical systems, the multiple pathways and alternative energy sources, ensuring that temporary failures of individual components would not compromise the overall mission objectives that represented decades of patient work toward ultimate conquest. The final activation sequence that would transform the celestial meat clock from energy collection system into active portal generator required perfect synchronization between all 12 children's psychic output combined with Vecna's own considerable abilities, the precise timing and frequency coordination, demanding levels of control that pushed both organic and hybrid consciousness to operational limits that left no margin for error or hesitation during the critical moments when dimensional barriers would be at their weakest and most vulnerable to penetration by forces that had waited eons for this opportunity to expand their dominion into realms that had previously remained beyond their reach. The transformation of innocent children into components of cosmic horror represented not only the ultimate violation of human dignity, but also the perversion of natural psychic gifts into instruments of destruction that would enable the annihilation of countless civilizations whose only crime had been existing in dimensions that attracted the attention of predatory intelligences whose appetites could never be satisfied through conventional conquest, but required the complete absorption of all consciousness and creativity that made existence meaningful for beings whose understanding of life transcended simple survival to encompass love and hope and dreams that would be extinguished forever if the Mind Flayer's plans achieved their terrible fulfillment through machinery built from the suffering of children who deserved protection rather than exploitation by entities whose cosmic Ambitions recognized no moral boundaries or ethical limitations that might restrain their hunger for universal domination. The ancient portal that would serve as gateway for the Mind Flayer's final assault upon our dimension began its formation deep within the corrupted laboratories of Hawkins National Laboratory's shadow reflection, the massive sphere of writhing energy that hung suspended in the darkness, representing not merely an opening between worlds, but a cosmic wound that would bleed reality itself until every trace of familiar existence had been drained away into the insatiable maw of an intelligence whose appetite for consumption extended beyond physical matter to encompass the complete absorption of consciousness, memory, and possibility that had taken billions of years to evolve within the protective boundaries of our unsuspecting universe. The interdimensional gateway that Vecna labored to create through his grotesque machinery of living flesh and psychic torment possessed characteristics that distinguished it from the crude portals that had occasionally torn brief holes between realms during previous crisis event. Its sophisticated engineering, designed to remain stable under conditions that would have instantly collapsed simpler constructions while providing passage capacity sufficient to accommodate invasion forces whose numbers reflected the accumulated military might of an empire that had conquered countless dimensions throughout cosmic history that stretched back to epochs when our galaxy was nothing more than scattered dust clouds, waiting for gravity to begin the slow work of stellar formation. The energy requirements that governed the portal's creation demanded not only the combined psychic output of 12 enhanced children, but also the precise coordination of forces that operated according to principles that transcended conventional understanding of physics and engineering. The Mind Flayer's knowledge of interdimensional mechanics having been accumulated through eons of experience with cosmic construction projects that required manipulation of fundamental forces governing the relationship between consciousness and reality in ways that allowed thought itself to become the raw material from which new forms of existence could be sculpted according to designs that reflected appetites too alien for human comprehension. The sphere of swirling darkness that served as the portal's visible manifestation contained within its writhing surface glimpses of landscapes that belonged to Dimension X. The brief flashes of alien geography revealing territories where matter obeyed different laws and consciousness flowed according to patterns that created unity through absorption rather than cooperation. These momentary windows into cosmic horror, providing terrifying preview of what Earth's fate would become once the gateway achieved sufficient stability to permit full-scale invasion by entities whose physical forms defied description, in languages that had evolved to communicate about phenomena that followed earthly rules of biology and physics. The gravitational distortions that surrounded the emerging portal created effects that extended far beyond simple spatial warping to include temporal anomalies that caused time itself to flow differently in the immediate vicinity of the portal's interdimensional breach. These chronological irregularities making it impossible for observers to accurately measure the duration of events or predict the sequence in which consequences would unfold once the gateway reached critical mass and began operating according to its intended specifications as transportation hub for cosmic invasion forces. The electromagnetic interference that radiated outward from the portal's location disrupted electronic systems throughout Hawkins, while creating atmospheric disturbances that manifested as unnatural weather patterns and environmental changes that reflected the gradual contamination of local reality by influences that originated in dimensions where different physical laws governed the behavior of matter and energy. The spreading zones of distortion, serving as early warning signs that conventional science remained helpless to interpret or address through technological countermeasures. The resonance frequencies that emanated from the portal created sympathetic vibrations in human consciousness that produced psychological effects ranging from inexplicable anxiety and depression to complete mental breakdown among sensitive individuals who lacked the protective barriers that allowed psychically gifted people to maintain their sanity when exposed to energies that carried information about forms of existence that were fundamentally incompatible with patterns of thought that had evolved within the relatively simple framework of earthly experience. The cosmic geography that the portal was designed to access included not only Dimension X, but also the network of conquered territories that served as staging areas and supply depots for the Mind Flayer's interdimensional empire. The gateway's sophisticated targeting systems ensuring that invasion forces could be drawn from multiple sources while maintaining the element of strategic surprise that had proven essential for successful conquest campaigns throughout cosmic history, that included the systematic elimination of civilizations whose defensive capabilities might have posed serious challenges to conventional assault methods. The biological contamination that began seeping through the portal, even before it reached full operational capacity, introduced alien microorganisms and energy patterns into Earth's biosphere that would gradually transform the fundamental characteristics of life itself. These invasive influences, designed to prepare the environment for occupation by entities whose physiological requirements differed drastically from those of carbon-based life forms that depended upon stable atmospheric conditions and predictable chemical processes for survival and reproduction. The psychological warfare component of the portal's design included transmission of mental influences that would undermine human resistance by promoting despair and hopelessness among potential defenders, while simultaneously enhancing aggressive tendencies that would lead to internal conflicts and social breakdown that would weaken organized opposition to interdimensional invasion forces, whose tactical doctrine emphasized exploitation of target species' psychological vulnerabilities rather than relying solely upon overwhelming military superiority. The quantum entanglement effects that linked the emerging portal to similar gateways throughout the Mind Flayer's empire created communication networks that allowed real-time coordination of invasion activities across multiple dimensions while providing intelligence gathering capabilities that gave cosmic commanders comprehensive awareness of defensive preparations and resistance activities that might interfere with conquest operations that had been planned with meticulous attention to detail based upon centuries of observation and analysis of human behavioral patterns. The energy cascade that would be triggered by the portal's full activation represented point of no return, beyond which Earth's transformation from independent world to absorbed territory would become irreversible through any means available to human technology or determination. The threshold conditions for this catastrophic transition having been calculated with mathematical precision that reflected the Mind Flayer's understanding of cosmic mechanics that had been refined through experience with thousands of previous conquest campaigns. The temporal acceleration effect that surrounded the portal created zones where cause and effect relationships became fluid and malleable. These distorted areas serving as testing grounds where the Mind Flayer could experiment with different approaches to reality manipulation while gathering data about the specific characteristics of Earth's dimensional structure that would inform final phase implementation of conquest protocols that had been adapted and modified based upon lessons learned during the subjugation of countless other civilizations. The consciousness absorption mechanisms that had been integrated into the portal's operating systems would begin extracting and processing human awareness patterns As soon as dimensional stability reached minimum viable thresholds, the harvesting process designed to preserve useful memories and creative capabilities while eliminating individual identity markers that might resist integration into collective intelligence networks that served the Mind Flayer's agenda for expanding its understanding of universe through accumulation of diverse perspectives and experiences. The reality restructuring capabilities that the portal would enable, once fully operational, included transformation of physical laws governing matter and energy throughout Earth's dimension. These fundamental changes designed to create environmental conditions that would support the Mind Flayer's preferred forms of existence while making survival impossible for unmodified human consciousness that lacked the adaptive mechanisms necessary for functioning under cosmic conditions that bore no resemblance to the stable frameworks that had enabled terrestrial life to flourish. The cosmic significance of the portal's successful activation extended far beyond simple conquest of a single world to encompass strategic positioning for expansion into adjacent dimensional territories that contain civilizations whose defensive capabilities and cultural achievements represented valuable additions to the Mind Flayer's growing empire. Earth's location within interdimensional space, providing access to cosmic highways that connected multiple galaxy clusters, whose combined resources would fuel further conquest campaigns. The irreversible nature of the changes that would follow the portal's completion reflected the Mind Flayer's understanding that successful conquest required not temporary occupation, but permanent transformation that eliminated any possibility of resistance or rebellion by absorbed populations. The thorough integration of conquered territories into imperial structure, ensuring that previous identity and cultural patterns would be completely erased and replaced by systems that served only the ancient intelligence's appetite for expansion and consumption, that recognized no limitations except insufficient power to overcome remaining pockets of independence throughout the universe. The countdown toward dimensional catastrophe that began with the portal's first stirrings of energy represented humanity's final opportunity to prevent cosmic horror that would transform Earth from sanctuary of life and love into feeding ground for appetites that had already consumed more civilizations than human mathematics possessed numbers adequate to calculate. The approaching threshold beyond which intervention would become impossible, serving as ultimate test of whether ordinary people could find within themselves extraordinary courage necessary to stand against forces that had never before encountered successful resistance during their march across the bay. Cosmos toward universal domination. The youngest member of the Wheeler family, whose innocent presence in Vecna's twisted realm of memories and nightmares would prove far more significant than anyone could have anticipated, began her terrifying journey through psychological landscapes that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human consciousness, when she found herself trapped alongside Max Sinclair in spaces that defied every natural law governing the relationship between mind and reality. Her small form, moving through corridors of recollection and chambers of suppressed trauma with the kind of determined curiosity that characterized children who had not yet learned to fear the unknown territories that adults avoided through instinctive recognition of dangers that exceeded their capacity for comprehension or resistance. Holly Wheeler's presence within the mind space that Vecna had constructed from fragments of stolen memories and crystallized suffering represented not accidental capture, but deliberate selection based upon psychic capabilities that remained dormant within her developing consciousness. Her natural sensitivity to supernatural influences, making her uniquely qualified to navigate environments where thought became geography and emotional resonance determined the physics that governed movement and interaction between beings whose existence transcended simple categories of living and dead, real and imaginary, past and present. The cleric-like abilities that Holly manifested during her imprisonment in Vecna's psychological maze reflected not training or conscious development, but innate gifts that had been awakening gradually throughout her young life, her capacity for healing and protection, expressing itself through instinctive actions that drew upon sources of power that existed beyond the reach of scientific measurement, while operating according to spiritual principles that connected her consciousness to cosmic forces that served purposes, opposed to the Mind Flayer's agenda for universal conquest and absorption. The doorways that Holly and Max encountered during their desperate search for escape routes led not to physical locations but to preserved moments from various individuals' lives, each portal offering passage into experiences that had been extracted from their original owners and archived within Vecna's vast collection of human memories that served both as psychological torture device and comprehensive database of information about behavioral patterns and emotional vulnerabilities that could be exploited during future manipulation and control operations. The memories that surrounded the two girls during their journey through Vecna's domain belonged not only to his direct victims, but also to countless individuals whose consciousness had been touched by his influence throughout decades of gradual infiltration of human society. Their stolen recollections, creating a library of experiences that provided the ancient intelligence with detailed understanding of human nature and social dynamics that had been gathered through systematic violation of mental privacy, psychological autonomy that represented crimes against consciousness itself. The recognition that Vecna displayed toward Holly's exceptional intelligence reflected his own memories of being a gifted child whose intellectual capabilities had set him apart from his peers in ways that created both pride, isolation, his identification with her cleverness revealing fragments of Henry Creel's original personality that still existed, buried beneath layers of alien influence and cosmic corruption that had transformed innocent curiosity into instruments of manipulation and control that served appetites that recognized no moral boundaries or ethical limitations. The Tom Riddle comparison that observers would later make when analyzing Holly's interactions with Vecna highlighted disturbing parallels between her situation and fictional narratives about brilliant children whose exceptional abilities made them attractive targets for corruption by evil, forces that sought to recruit promising young minds into service of agendas that promised power and knowledge in exchange for abandoning moral principles and human compassion that normally provided protection against temptations that appealed to intellectual pride and desire for recognition. The portal opening capabilities that Holly began demonstrating during her imprisonment suggested that her psychic potential extended far beyond simple sensitivity to supernatural phenomena to encompass active manipulation of interdimensional barriers that normally required enormous energy, expenditures to penetrate or modify her natural gifts, providing hope that escape might be possible through methods that bypassed Vecna's security systems, which had been designed to contain prisoners whose abilities fell within conventional ranges of human psychic development. The protective instincts that Holly displayed toward Max during their shared captivity revealed strength of character that transcended her chronological age, while demonstrating the kind of selfless courage that had characterized her family's response to supernatural crises throughout multiple encounters with forces that threatened not only their individual safety, but the welfare of entire communities whose survival depended upon ordinary people finding extraordinary reserves of determination and compassion when confronted with cosmic horror. The way that Holly navigated through different layers of memory space with intuitive understanding of psychological geography suggested that her consciousness operated according to principles that allowed direct perception of emotional and spiritual realities that remained invisible to people whose awareness was limited to physical phenomena. Her ability to sense the underlying currents of meaning and connection that flowed beneath surface appearances of chaotic nightmare, making her an invaluable guide through territories where conventional navigation methods would have led to certaines destructions. The resistance that Holly demonstrated to Vecna's attempts at mental manipulation reflected not only natural psychological resilience, but also spiritual protection that originated from sources beyond her conscious understanding. Her connection to cosmic forces that opposed the Mind Flayer's agenda, providing shields against forms of corruption that had successfully contaminated older and more experienced minds, whose defenses had been worn down through exposure to influences that gradually eroded moral clarity and emotional stability. The conversations that Holly engaged in with imprisoned aspects of Max's consciousness revealed remarkable maturity and wisdom that enabled her to provide comfort and encouragement to someone whose psychological wounds ran far deeper than her own traumatic experiences. Her instinctive understanding of how to offer hope without denying the reality of their desperate circumstances, demonstrating emotional intelligence that had been shaped by exposure to family crises that had taught her lessons about courage and perseverance that most children never needed to learn. The memory fragments that Holly encountered during her exploration of Vecna's domain provided her with glimpses of his original nature before corruption had transformed Henry Creel into something monstrous. These preserved echoes of childhood innocence and artistic sensitivity, revealing that redemption might still be possible for someone whose fundamental humanity had been buried, but not entirely destroyed by decades of service to alien intelligences, whose influence could be resisted by consciousness that retained connection to sources of love and compassion. The escape routes that Holly began identifying through her systematic exploration of the mind space reflected not random discovery, but methodical application of problem-solving skills that combined childlike creativity with surprisingly sophisticated understanding of how psychological imprisonment could be overcome through approaches that bypassed conventional security measures and exploited vulnerabilities that existed in systems designed by intelligence that understood human nature, but had never fully grasped the power of innocence and determination, working in combination. The healing abilities that Holly manifested during moments when Max's psychological condition deteriorated beyond normal endurance suggested that her natural gifts extended beyond simple psychic sensitivity to encompass active restoration of damaged consciousness through methods that drew upon spiritual resources that had been developing throughout her life without conscious recognition or formal training, in techniques that normally required years of study and practice to master effectively. The leadership role that Holly gradually assumed during their imprisonment reflected not desire for authority, but natural response to circumstances that required someone to maintain focus on ultimate objectives when despair and confusion threatened to overwhelm efforts at escape. Her ability to inspire hope and coordinate actions, demonstrating qualities that would serve her well throughout future encounters with supernatural forces that tested human resolve and determination. The portal manipulation techniques that Holly developed through experimentation with different approaches to dimensional barriers revealed intuitive understanding of cosmic mechanics that operated according to principles that transcended conventional physics. her success in creating temporary openings between memory spaces suggesting that sustained effort might eventually produce pathways that could lead to genuine escape from psychological prison that had been designed to be inescapable. The courage that Holly displayed when confronting Vecna directly, during moments when his attention focused upon their escape attempts, demonstrated reserves of strength that had been forged through family experiences with supernatural crisis, combined with natural fearlessness that characterized children who had not yet learned to doubt their own capability for achieving seemingly impossible goals when motivated by love for people whose welfare depended upon their willingness to risk everything in service of protecting those who could not protect themselves. The significance of Holly's presence within Vecna's domain extended far beyond simple imprisonment to encompass her role as catalyst for changes that might ultimately contribute to the ancient entity's defeat through methods that combined psychic ability with moral clarity and determination that reflected the best aspects of human nature when faced with challenges that demanded responses that transcended individual self-interest to embrace collective welfare and the preservation of values that made existence meaningful for beings whose consciousness had evolved to encompass love and hope and dreams that deserved protection from forces that sought to transform all reality into feeding grounds for appetites that recognized no purpose except endless consumption and expansion. The mathematical poetry that would ultimately determine the fate of not only Hawkins but potentially all existence itself resided in the elegant simplicity of numbers that had been encoded within the framework of a children's bake game, the perfect 20-sided die roll that represented absolute success in Dungeons and Dragons, serving as metaphor for the precise coordination of psychic abilities that would be required to overcome cosmic forces whose power had been accumulating across eons of interdimensional conquest, while the heroes who would stand against such overwhelming odds remained unaware that their individual strengths were meaningful only when combined according to patterns that transcended simple addition to create exponential increases in capability through harmonious synchronization of Venn consciousness. 11's psychic abilities, refined through years of traumatic experimentation and strengthened by experiences that had forced her to push beyond every limitation that human physiology normally imposed upon consciousness-based manipulation of physical reality, represented the primary foundation upon which any successful resistance to the Mind Flayer's invasion would necessarily be built. Her capacity for telekinetic force and dimensional perception, providing essential tools for engaging with enemies whose existence transcended conventional understanding of biology and physics, while her emotional connection to friends and family served as anchor point that prevented complete dissolution of individual identity during encounters with collective intelligences that sought to absorb all consciousness into their expanding networks of unified thought. The number 8 that had been assigned to Kali during her imprisonment within Hawkins National Laboratory reflected not arbitrary designation, but recognition of her unique position within the spectrum of psychic abilities that had been artificially created through Brenner's experiments. Her specialization in creating realistic illusions that could deceive both human perception and sophisticated detection equipment, providing tactical advantages that would prove essential during conflicts where conventional weapons remained useless against entities whose physical forms existed partially outside normal space-time, while her personal history of trauma and abandonment created psychological resilience that enabled her to function effectively under pressure that might have paralyzed individuals whose development had followed more conventional patterns. Will Byers' designation as Subject 1 in the cosmic equation that would determine universal survival reflected his unique role as bridge between human consciousness and the hive mind collective that characterized the mind, Flayer's preferred form of existence. His extended exposure to interdimensional influences during his imprisonment in the shadow realm, having created neural pathways and sensory capabilities that allowed him to perceive and potentially influence the alien intelligence's communication networks, while his fundamental humanity and connection to family and friends provided protection against complete absorption into systems that had consumed countless other beings throughout cosmic history. The arithmetic that produced perfect 20 through combination of 11 plus 8 plus 1 represented more than simple numerical coincidence to encompass profound truth about how individual capabilities could be multiplied rather than merely combined when consciousness worked together according to principles that recognize the fundamental interconnectedness of all awareness, while respecting the unique contributions that each participant brought to collaborative efforts that required both unified purpose and diverse perspectives to achieve objectives that remained beyond the reach of any single individual, regardless of their personal power or determination. The Dungeons and Dragons framework that provided metaphorical structure for understanding this cosmic battle reflected the game's origins in mythology and literature that had always recognized the fundamental truth that evil of sufficient magnitude could only be defeated through cooperation between heroes whose individual strengths complemented each other in ways that created capabilities that exceeded simple summation of separate abilities. The role-playing mechanics serving as training ground, where young minds could practice the kind of coordination and mutual support that would be necessary when fantasy became reality and imaginary monsters revealed themselves as genuine threats to existence itself. The psychic resonance that would emerge when all three enhanced individuals focused their abilities in perfect harmony promised to create energy patterns that could penetrate the Mind Flayer's defenses while disrupting the dimensional barriers that protected its true location within Dimension X. Their combined consciousness generating frequencies that had never before been achieved through human awareness, and therefore remained outside the ancient intelligence's experience, with resistance from conquered civilizations whose defensive capabilities had always fallen within predictable parameters that could be countered through established tactical doctrines. Will's specialized ability to influence and potentially control the hive mind networks that coordinated the Mind Flayer's various servants and manifestations throughout multiple dimensions represented strategic advantage that could transform the entire nature of the conflict from direct confrontation between opposing forces into subtle infiltration and subversion of command systems that had never been designed to resist corruption from within, his human perspective and emotional connections providing protection against complete assimilation, while his enhanced neural architecture allowed access to communication channels that remained invisible to conventional psychic perception. Kali's mastery of illusion creation offered tactical possibilities that extended far beyond simple deception to encompass reality manipulation on scales that could confuse and misdirect cosmic intelligences whose understanding of truth and falsehood had been shaped by eons of experience with civilizations whose consciousness operated according to patterns that made their thoughts predictable and their responses readily anticipated. Her ability to create false realities that seemed genuine, even to enhanced perception, providing opportunities for strategic surprise that might enable successful attacks against targets that normally remained beyond reach of earthly weapons or abilities. The emotional bonds that connected the three psychic individuals to their families and friends would serve as more than simple motivation during the ultimate confrontation with forces that sought to eliminate all traces of love and compassion from universal existence, their connections to ordinary human relationships, providing spiritual anchors that prevented absorption into collective consciousness, while simultaneously amplifying their individual capabilities through access to energies that originated in realms where cooperation enhanced rather than diminished personal identity and creative potential. The timing that would be required to achieve perfect synchronization of their combined abilities demanded not only technical precision, but also intuitive understanding of each other's psychological patterns and emotional needs. Their success, depending upon forms of communication that transcended verbal language to encompass direct sharing of consciousness that allowed real-time coordination of complex operations while maintaining individual autonomy and decision-making capability that distinguished collaborative effort from the hive mind absorption that characterized their primary opponent's approach to incorporating useful resources. The sacrifice that such perfect coordination would require from each participant extended beyond simple willingness to risk personal safety to encompass complete trust in companions whose backgrounds and personalities differed dramatically from their own. Their ability to function as unified force, depending upon emotional maturity and spiritual development that had been forged through experiences with loss and trauma that had taught them lessons about the true value of human connection and the importance of protecting relationships that provided meaning and purpose to existence that might otherwise seem meaningless when contemplated from cosmic perspectives. The strategic implications of their potential success extended far beyond saving Earth from dimensional invasion to encompass disruption of the Mind Flayer's expansion throughout multiple universes whose civilizations had never before encountered effective resistance to cosmic predation, their victory serving as proof that consciousness, organized according to principles of love and cooperation, could defeat intelligence based solely upon consumption and domination, regardless of the power disparities that seemed to make such outcomes impossible, according to conventional understanding of conflict resolution. The ripple effects that would follow successful deployment of the perfect 20 combination promised to inspire resistance movements throughout the interdimensional territories that had been conquered by the Mind Flayer during its march. Across cosmic history, the example of ordinary humans achieving impossible victory through friendship and mutual support, providing hope to countless beings whose civilizations had been absorbed, but whose essential consciousness might still be capable of rebellion if provided with evidence that liberation remained possible despite overwhelming odds and centuries of oppression. The training that had prepared each of the three psychic individuals for this ultimate test had occurred not through formal instruction, but through lived experience, with supernatural crises that had forced them to develop capabilities and character traits that would prove essential when facing challenges that exceeded anything they had previously encountered. Their education in heroism having been conducted through encounters with increasingly dangerous situations that had gradually built their confidence and competence, while strengthening relationships that would sustain them during moments when individual courage might have proven insufficient. The legacy that their combined effort would create extended beyond simple military victory to encompass transformation of human understanding about the nature of consciousness and the possibilities that emerged when individual awareness was enhanced through connection with others, rather than isolation in separate identity structures that limited potential while creating vulnerability to forces that specialized in exploiting loneliness and despair to achieve conquest objectives that required the elimination of hope and finance. Compassion from target populations. The mathematical perfection of their synchronized abilities represented not cold calculation, but poetic expression of truth about how love could multiply individual strengths in ways that created capabilities sufficient to challenge cosmic horror. Their achievement of the perfect 20, demonstrating that friendship and loyalty and shared commitment to protecting innocence could generate power that transcended physical limitations to encompass spiritual dimensions where ordinary people could become extraordinary heroes through willingness to risk everything in service of values that made existence beautiful and meaningful for beings whose consciousness had evolved to embrace purposes larger than simple survival or personal advancement in hierarchies that measured worth according to material accumulation rather than capacity for love and sacrifice and creative contribution to collective welfare that honored the dignity and potential of all living beings. The scientific architect, whose twisted vision of human potential would ultimately provide the foundation for cosmic horror that threatened to consume all existence, began his career with the kind of idealistic ambition that characterized researchers who believed that knowledge itself was inherently virtuous, regardless of the methods employed to obtain it, or the purposes for which such understanding might eventually be applied. Dr. Martin Brenner's early work in psychology and neurology, reflecting genuine desire to unlock the mysteries of human consciousness while helping individuals whose mental capabilities had been limited by trauma or developmental disorders that prevented them from achieving their full potential within conventional educational and social frameworks. The discovery of young Henry Creel's transformed nature following his mysterious 12-hour disappearance in the Nevada caves represented the pivotal moment when Brenner's academic curiosity evolved into something far more dangerous and morally ambiguous. His recognition that the boy possessed abilities that transcended every known limitation of human consciousness, creating opportunities for research that promised to revolutionize scientific understanding of reality itself while opening doorways to applications that could transform humanity's relationship with the physical world in ways that seemed to offer unlimited possibilities for advancement and exploration. The blood samples that Brenner extracted from Henry during those early examinations contained within their cellular structure the genetic keys that would eventually unlock psychic potential in dozens of other children whose tragic fate was sealed the moment their DNA was modified according to patterns that had been derived from analysis of Henry's transformed physiology, each injection and treatment representing another step in a program that would systematically create artificial psychic abilities while destroying the normal childhood development that should have protected young minds from exposure to forces that exceeded their emotional and psychological capacity to understand or control. The laboratory facility that was constructed to house and study these enhanced children became a monument to scientific ambition, unconstrained by ethical considerations or human compassion. Its sterile corridors and observation chambers, creating an environment where young people could be monitored and manipulated according to experimental protocols that treated them as test subjects rather than human beings deserving of love and protection from adults whose responsibility included safeguarding childhood innocence rather than exploiting it for purposes that served institutional agendas rather than individual welfare. The numbered system that was imposed upon the children reflected Brenner's desire to maintain clinical objectivity while conducting research that required him to ignore the emotional reality of what he was doing to young people who had been stolen from their families and forced to participate in experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics and human rights that civilized society had developed to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation by those who possessed authority and resources that could be used to harm rather than heal. The Papa persona that Brenner adopted in his interactions with the laboratory children represented psychological manipulation designed to create artificial family bonds that would ensure compliance with experimental protocols while providing emotional control mechanisms that could be exploited. Whenever individual subjects showed signs of rebellion or resistance to procedures that caused physical pain and psychological trauma in service of research objectives that prioritized data collection over human welfare, the decades of experimentation that followed Henry's initial capture produced mountains of research data about psychic phenomena, while simultaneously creating a generation of traumatized young people whose abilities had been purchased through suffering that would mark them for life even if they survived the various crises and catastrophes that resulted from Brenner's inability to understand or control the forces that his programs had unleashed upon an unsuspecting world that lacked adequate preparation for dealing with supernatural threats that originated in scientific laboratories rather than natural evolution. The government support that enabled Brenner's research programs reflected institutional priorities that valued potential military applications over human rights concerns, the funding and legal protection that surrounded his work, creating conditions where illegal experimentation could continue for years without oversight or accountability, while producing results that seemed to justify continued investment in approaches that treated human consciousness as raw material, to be refined and weaponized according to strategic objectives that recognized no moral boundaries or ethical limitations. Dr. Sam Owens's involvement in the programs that Brenner had initiated represented an attempt to impose more humane standards upon research that had already caused immeasurable damage to countless individuals whose lives had been destroyed by scientific curiosity that had evolved into systematic abuse disguised as legitimate investigation of phenomena that demanded careful study and respectful treatment of subjects, whose cooperation should have been voluntary rather than coerced through imprisonment and manipulation. The mysterious connection that would eventually be revealed between Dr. Owens and the original research programs suggested personal history that had shaped her understanding of both the potential benefits and devastating costs associated with psychic enhancement research. Her knowledge of classified information and her emotional investment in protecting the surviving children, indicating relationships and experiences that extended back to the earliest phases of experimentation when the full implications of what was being attempted remained hidden even from those who were directly involved in implementation. The institutional memory that survived within government agencies despite personnel changes and administrative reorganizations contained detailed records of everything that had been learned through decades of illegal human experimentation. The accumulated knowledge about psychic phenomena and dimensional manipulation, providing foundation for understanding threats that ordinary citizens could never have imagined, while simultaneously revealing the extent to which official secrecy had concealed crimes against humanity that had been committed in the name of national security and scientific advancement. The cover-up operations that had been necessary to conceal the true scope of Brenner's research programs required coordination between multiple agencies and departments whose cooperation was maintained through combination of shared complicity and mutual blackmail that ensured silence about activities that would have triggered massive public outrage if their details had ever been disclosed through legitimate oversight processes or investigative journalism that possessed adequate resources and legal protection to pursue stories that challenged powerful institutions. The legacy of suffering that resulted from the psychic enhancement programs extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass families whose children had been stolen and communities that had been exposed to supernatural dangers. Without their knowledge or consent, the ripple effects of institutional criminality, creating waves of trauma and loss that continued spreading through subsequent generations, while those responsible for initiating such programs avoided accountability through legal immunity and bureaucratic protection that shielded them from consequences. The scientific knowledge that had been gained through systematic violation of human rights and dignity represented moral contradiction that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between research and ethics. The valuable insights about consciousness and reality that had been obtained through unconscionable methods, creating dilemmas about whether such information could ever be used for beneficial purposes without perpetuating the injustices that had made its acquisition possible. The recognition that every psychic ability displayed by any enhanced individual throughout the entire history of the program could be traced back to Henry Creel's transformed blood, revealed the true extent to which the mind flayer's influence had penetrated human civilization through scientific channels that had seemed to offer hope for human advancement, while actually serving purposes that aimed at species subjugation and eventual absorption into cosmic collective intelligence that recognized no value in individual consciousness or creative diversity. The irony that the same research programs that had been designed to give humanity advantages in potential conflicts with extraterrestrial or interdimensional threats had actually provided those very enemies with the tools and pathways necessary for invasion and conquest demonstrated how scientific ambition without moral guidance could become instrument of destruction rather than liberation. The pursuit of knowledge and power ultimately serving purposes that were diametrically opposed to human welfare and survival. The children who had survived the laboratory programs carried within their enhanced abilities both tremendous potential for heroic action and constant reminders of the price that had been paid for capabilities that should never have been artificially created through methods that violated everything that civilized society claimed to value about human dignity and the protection of innocence from exploitation by those whose authority and resources enabled them to pursue objectives that served institutional interests rather than individual or collective human welfare. The ultimate revelation that the entire history of psychic research within government agencies had been unwittingly orchestrated by alien intelligence that had used human ambition and scientific curiosity to create the very weapons that would be turned against humanity during the final phase of interdimensional invasion, represented cosmic irony that demonstrated how easily civilizations could be manipulated into engineering their own destruction through appeals to their highest aspirations and most noble intentions when those motivations were guided by influences that understood human psychology well enough to exploit weakness and virtue with equal effectiveness. The responsibility that would fall upon survivors of these programs to use abilities that had been obtained through suffering and injustice for purposes of protecting the very society that had failed to protect them from institutional abuse required forms of forgiveness and moral courage that transcended simple heroism to encompass spiritual wisdom that could transform personal trauma into universal service, despite justified anger and resentment that might otherwise have led to abandonment of people who had allowed such crimes to occur through indifference or complicity with systems that prioritized security and advancement over human rights and dignity. The girl whose consciousness hung suspended between worlds of waking and dream found herself trapped in territories that existed beyond the reach of conventional medicine or psychological intervention. Max Mayfield's catatonic form lying motionless in the sterile hospital bed while her true self wandered through nightmare landscapes that had been constructed from fragments of memory and crystallized trauma, her awareness drifting through spaces where Vecna's influence had created psychological prison that seemed designed to hold her indefinitely, while her physical body gradually weakened under conditions that no earthly treatment could address adequately. The coma that had claimed Max following her heroic confrontation with forces that exceeded human comprehension represented more than simple medical emergency to encompass spiritual crisis that challenged every assumption about the relationship between consciousness and physical form, her vital signs remaining stable enough to maintain hope while providing no indication of when or whether she might return to awareness that could reconnect her spirit with flesh that waited patiently for reunion with the essential self that defined her identity and made her existence meaningful to everyone who loved her. The hospital corridors that Lucas Sinclair paced during endless hours of vigil reflected his desperate need to remain physically close to someone whose consciousness had been separated from her body through supernatural intervention that conventional medical science remained powerless to understand or reverse, his presence serving as anchor point that might somehow provide guidance for lost awareness that needed connection to familiar voices and loving concern to find its way back from territories where healing required more than medications or technological intervention. The Demogorgon attacks that Vecna launched against the medical facility demonstrated his recognition that Max's consciousness posed ongoing threat to his psychological control systems, even while her body remained helpless, vulnerable to physical assault. The monsters that infiltrated the building serving as extensions of his will to eliminate someone whose spiritual strength and emotional resilience had already proven capable of resisting mental manipulation that had successfully overwhelmed other victims who lacked similar foundations of courage and determination. The evacuation procedures that Lucas initiated when supernatural forces breached hospital security reflected his understanding that protecting Max's physical form required removing her from environments where conventional defenses remained useless against entities that could move through dimensions and manipulate matter according to principles that transcended earthly understanding of biology and physics. His willingness to risk everything for her safety, demonstrating love that operated according to priorities that valued her welfare above his own survival or comfort. The unconscious body that Lucas carried through corridors, filled with otherworldly horror, represented not burden, but precious cargo, whose protection justified any sacrifice that might be required to ensure her survival until her own consciousness could complete its journey back from realms where psychological healing proceeded according to timetables that bore no relationship to medical expectations or family desperation that demanded immediate results from processes that required patience and faith in outcomes that could not be guaranteed or controlled through conventional intervention. The mind space where Max's awareness remained trapped with Holly Wheeler provided opportunities for healing that existed beyond the reach of earthly medicine while creating challenges that tested both girls' capacity for mutual support and collaborative problem-solving under conditions that demanded spiritual resources rather than physical strength or intellectual analysis. Their shared imprisonment becoming vehicle for recovery that proceeded through stages of acceptance and forgiveness that conventional therapy might have required years to achieve. The memories that surrounded Max during her psychological imprisonment included not only her own experiences but also fragments of consciousness that belonged to other victims whose awareness had been absorbed into Vecna's collection. of stolen thoughts and emotions, her exposure to this vast archive of human suffering, providing perspective on pain and trauma that transcended individual circumstances to encompass universal patterns of loss and resilience that characterized all conscious beings who faced challenges that exceeded their apparent capacity for survival. The healing process that gradually restored Max's psychological integrity proceeded through confrontation with suppressed guilt and unresolved grief that had created vulnerabilities which Vecna had exploited during his initial assault upon her consciousness. Her journey toward wholeness, requiring acceptance of responsibility for choices that had seemed to contribute to tragedies, while simultaneously recognizing that survival, guilt, and self-blame served no constructive purpose in contexts where moving forward required forgiveness of self and others. The protective barriers that Max learned to construct around her consciousness during her imprisonment reflected growing understanding of how psychological defenses could be strengthened through spiritual practices that drew upon sources of power that existed beyond individual will or determination. Her development of mental shields and emotional armor providing protection against future attacks, while maintaining openness to connections with people whose love and support provided essential nourishment for consciousness that had been damaged by exposure to cosmic horror. The communication that occasionally flickered between Max's imprisoned awareness and her unconscious body created brief moments when vital signs fluctuated in patterns that provided hope to medical staff and family members who interpreted such variations as evidence of improving neurological function, rather than recognizing them as signs of struggle between spiritual forces that were fighting for control of consciousness, that had become battleground where human determination confronted alien intelligence. The medical equipment that monitored Max's physical condition during her extended coma provided data about brain activity and autonomic responses that revealed nothing about the true nature of her condition, while creating false confidence in technological approaches to healing that remained completely inadequate for addressing problems that originated in psychological and spiritual dimensions, where consciousness operated according to principles that transcended materialistic understanding of health and recovery. The family members and friends who maintained vigil beside Max's hospital bed served purposes that extended far beyond simple emotional support to encompass provision of spiritual anchors that helped prevent her consciousness from becoming completely lost in territories where individual identity could be absorbed into collective systems that eliminated personal autonomy and creative potential in favor of unified awareness that served purposes opposed to human values and aspirations. The gradual awakening that would eventually restore Max to conscious interaction with the physical world proceeded through stages that required integration of traumatic experiences, with renewed commitment to relationships and goals that provided meaning and purpose sufficient to justify continued existence despite knowledge of cosmic horrors that had forever changed her understanding of reality and humanity's place within universe that contained threats beyond conventional imagination or preparation. The neurological recovery that accompanied Max's return to consciousness would never completely erase the changes that had been created through her exposure to interdimensional influences and psychological trauma that exceeded normal human capacity for processing and integration. Her enhanced sensitivity to supernatural phenomena, serving as both gift and burden that would influence all future encounters with forces that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience and understanding. The memories that Max retained from her imprisonment in Vecna's psychological realm provided valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities and weaknesses, while simultaneously creating ongoing psychological challenges that required continued support from friends and family members who understood that recovery from such experiences demanded patience and commitment that extended far beyond simple medical treatment or conventional therapy approaches that lacked frameworks for addressing trauma that originated in cosmic rather than earthly sources. The significance of Max's successful escape from psychological imprisonment extended beyond personal victory to encompass proof that human consciousness possessed resources for resisting absorption into alien collective intelligence systems, even under conditions that seemed designed to make such resistance impossible. Her triumph, providing hope and inspiration for other victims, while demonstrating that love and friendship could provide protection against forces that had successfully conquered countless civilizations throughout cosmic history. The courage that Max would carry forward from her experience with psychological captivity and spiritual warfare represented transformation of trauma into wisdom that could serve protective functions during future encounters with supernatural threats, while providing foundation for helping other victims whose consciousness had been damaged through similar experiences with forces that operated beyond conventional understanding of mental health and recovery processes that required integration of spiritual and psychological approaches to healing. The relationship between Max's consciousness and her physical form that was restored through her escape from Vecna's imprisonment demonstrated resilience of human spirit when supported by love and determination that refused to accept defeat, even when circumstances seemed hopeless. And conventional wisdom suggested that some forms of damage exceeded possibility of repair or recovery through any available intervention or treatment that operated within normal parameters of medical science and psychological understanding. The question that haunted every observer who had witnessed the transformation of Henry Creel from innocent child into cosmic horror centered upon whether sufficient humanity remained buried beneath decades of alien influence and accumulated atrocities to make redemption possible for someone whose consciousness had been so thoroughly corrupted by exposure to intelligences that recognized no moral boundaries or ethical limitations in their pursuit of universal conquest and absorption. The parallel with fictional narratives about fallen heroes whose essential goodness might still exist, despite overwhelming evidence of evil actions creating hope that battled against rational assessment of crimes that seemed to place their perpetrator beyond any possibility of forgiveness or restoration. The Anakin Skywalker comparison that naturally arose when contemplating Henry's fate reflected humanity's enduring belief that love could reach even the most corrupted souls if sufficient compassion and determination were applied to the task of calling forth whatever fragments of original nature might survive beneath layers of darkness that had accumulated through years of choices that led progressively further away from light and connection toward isolation and malevolence that served purposes opposed to everything that made existence beautiful and meaningful for beings whose consciousness had evolved to embrace cooperation rather than domination. The boy who had once drawn pictures of spiders with artistic appreciation for their intricate beauty rather than sadistic fascination with their predatory nature represented the core identity that might still exist somewhere within Vecna's monstrous form. Those early memories of childhood wonder and creative expression, serving as potential anchor points where appeals to forgotten humanity might find purchase if delivered by voices that carried sufficient love and authenticity to penetrate psychological barriers that had been constructed through decades of trauma and alien manipulation that had systematically destroyed empathy and moral reasoning. The artistic sensitivity that had characterized young Henry's relationship with the natural world before his transformation suggested that appreciation for beauty and complexity had once formed central aspects of his personality, these aesthetic instincts potentially serving as pathways through which redemptive influences might reach consciousness that had been buried beneath layers of cosmic horror, but might still retain capacity for recognizing and responding to expressions of creativity and love that connected with deeply buried memories of times when existence had seemed precious rather than meaningless. The family relationships that had provided Henry with his first experiences of unconditional love and protection represented bonds that transcended simple biological connection to encompass spiritual ties that might prove more durable than the psychological modifications that had transformed him into instrument of alien conquest. The possibility that appeals to these foundational relationships could awaken dormant humanity, creating scenarios where redemption might occur through recognition of what had been lost and desire to reclaim connections that had once provided meaning and purpose. The decades of murder and manipulation that had characterized Vecna's existence since his transformation created moral debts that seemed to exceed any possibility of repayment or forgiveness, regardless of circumstances that had contributed to his corruption. The accumulated suffering of his victims and their families, representing weight of evil that might be too heavy for any individual consciousness to bear, while attempting the kind of fundamental transformation that redemption would require from someone whose actions had caused immeasurable pain and loss. The children who had died in Hawkins National Laboratory through Vecna's violence carried within their destruction evidence of capacity for evil that suggested complete moral corruption, rather than temporary influence that might be overcome through sufficient intervention or appeal to buried humanity, their innocent lives serving as testimony to transformations that had progressed so far beyond normal human psychology that redemption might represent impossible goal that ignored reality of crimes that demanded justice rather than mercy. The psychological mechanisms that had enabled Henry's survival within alien influence for so many decades might have required complete suppression of empathy and moral reasoning that made human consciousness possible. The adaptive strategies that had protected some fragment of his awareness from total absorption into collective intelligence, potentially destroying the very qualities that would be necessary for genuine redemption, while preserving only those aspects of personality that could serve purposes of cosmic conquest and manipulation. The question of whether love could reach across decades of accumulated evil and awaken dormant humanity within consciousness that had been systematically modified to serve alien purposes, represented test of fundamental beliefs about the calm nature of good and evil, and the possibility that even the most corrupted beings might retain capacity for transformation if sufficient compassion and determination were applied to the seemingly impossible task of calling forth whatever remained of original innocence and moral potential. The price that redemption would demand from Henry included not only acknowledgement of responsibility for countless deaths and immeasurable suffering, but also willingness to sacrifice everything, including his own existence, to prevent further harm from occurring through his continued survival, the ultimate expression of repentance requiring complete renunciation of power and influence that had been obtained through service to forces that sought to eliminate love and compassion from universal existence. The sacrifice that might serve as evidence of genuine transformation would necessarily involve using whatever remained of his enhanced abilities to protect rather than destroy the very people whose lives he had threatened and whose loved ones he had murdered. This complete reversal of purpose, requiring spiritual revolution that challenged every assumption about identity and meaning that had sustained his existence throughout decades of service to cosmic predators whose agenda included elimination of redemption as meaningful concept. The forgiveness that redemption would require from survivors of his actions represented burden that no individual should be asked to bear regardless of circumstances that might have contributed to criminal behavior. The families of victims possessing every right to demand justice rather than mercy, while the broader community struggled with questions about whether society could accept rehabilitation of someone whose crimes had exceeded normal categories of evil and threatened not only individual lives but the survival of entire civilizations. The time constraints that governed any potential redemption scenario created pressure that might make genuine transformation impossible to achieve or verify. The ongoing threat to universal existence demanding immediate action rather than extended processes of psychological healing and moral development that authentic change might require under normal circumstances where adequate opportunity existed for demonstrating sincerity through sustained patterns of constructive behavior and service to others. The legacy of trauma that Henry's actions had created throughout multiple generations of families and communities represented damage that could never be fully repaired, regardless of any subsequent attempts at atonement or service. The permanent scars left by supernatural violence and psychological torture, serving as testimony to transformations that might have progressed beyond any possibility of meaningful redemption within timeframes that allowed for practical consideration of alternatives to complete destruction. The cosmic stakes that surrounded questions of Henry's potential redemption elevated individual moral considerations to universal significance, where wrong choices might result in complete elimination of love and beauty from all existence. This escalation of consequences, creating context where mercy toward one individual might represent cruelty toward countless beings whose survival depended upon decisive action that prioritized collective welfare over personal transformation, regardless of how sincere or complete such change might appear. The precedent that successful redemption might establish for other beings whose consciousness had been corrupted through similar processes created additional complexity, where individual case became symbol of broader questions about justice and mercy that would influence treatment of future victims, whose circumstances might parallel Henry's experience with alien manipulation and gradual transformation from innocence into instruments of cosmic horror that threatened everything valuable about conscious existence. The ultimate question of whether redemption remained possible for someone whose corruption had reached cosmic scales represented challenge to fundamental beliefs about human nature and the power of love to overcome evil, regardless of how deeply rooted or extensively developed such darkness might have become. Through decades of choices that led progressively away from connection and empathy toward isolation and malevolence that served purposes opposed to life itself and everything that made existence worthwhile for beings whose consciousness had evolved to embrace, rather than destroy, the beauty and complexity that characterized reality at its most precious and vulnerable moments. The final desperate gambit that would determine whether conventional military forces could provide meaningful assistance during humanity's last stand against cosmic invasion began with recognition that traditional weapons and tactical doctrine remained utterly inadequate for confronting enemies whose existence transcended physical reality, while their capabilities exceeded every category of threat for which earthly defense systems had been designed. The brave men and women who comprised Hawkins' military garrison, understanding that their sacrifice might serve only symbolic purpose in conflict where victory depended upon forces that operated beyond the reach of bullets and explosives, and strategic planning that assumed rational opponents whose behavior followed predictable patterns. The The base perimeter that surrounded the interdimensional portal represented humanity's most advanced attempt at containing supernatural phenomena through conventional engineering and firepower. The fortifications and monitoring systems that had been constructed around the dimensional breach, reflecting both desperate hope that earthly technology might prove effective against cosmic threats and growing awareness that such defensive measures served primarily to provide early warning, rather than actual protection against entities whose capabilities rendered traditional military doctrine obsolete before engagement could even begin. Murray Bauman's increasingly frantic preparations for what appeared to be suicide mission reflected his understanding that conventional evacuation procedures would prove inadequate when facing enemies that could pursue fleeing personnel through dimensions where normal concepts of distance and time became meaningless. His desperate plan to drive directly through the portal with passengers who might survive interdimensional travel serving as last resort option when all other escape routes had been eliminated by forces that recognized no boundaries between realms of existence. The vehicle that Murray had modified for potential interdimensional transport bore only superficial resemblance to ordinary automobile, despite sharing basic configuration and control systems. The specialized equipment and protective measures that had been hastily installed throughout its interior reflecting combination of theoretical knowledge about dimensional physics and practical desperation that demanded action, even when success remained impossible to predict or guarantee through conventional testing and preparation procedures. Robin Buckley's assignment to coordinate distraction operations, while her friends attempted more direct intervention against Vecna's portal machinery, demonstrated tactical wisdom that recognized the importance of preventing military interference with supernatural rescue missions whose success depended upon precision and timing that could be disrupted by well-intentioned conventional forces, whose presence might create additional complications during operations that already pushed human capabilities beyond established limits of endurance and coordination. The communication systems that connected various elements of the resistance effort operated according to protocols that had been developed for conventional warfare rather than interdimensional crisis management. The radio networks and command structures that governed military response, revealing inadequacies that became apparent only when supernatural phenomena disrupted normal patterns of information flow and decision-making processes that assumed reliable contact between field units and command. Personnel who possessed adequate understanding of tactical situations. The weapons that had been deployed around the portal site represented humanity's most sophisticated attempts at creating firepower that might prove effective against entities whose physical forms defied conventional understanding of biology and vulnerability. The experimental energy weapons and modified conventional armaments, serving as testament to human ingenuity and determination, even when facing opponents whose capabilities exceeded every category of threat for which earthly military science had developed countermeasures. The personnel who volunteered for what amounted to suicide missions understood that their sacrifice might serve no practical purpose beyond providing time for civilian evacuation and supernatural intervention that offered humanity's only realistic hope for survival. Their willingness to face cosmic horror with conventional weapons demonstrating courage that transcended rational calculation of odds while reflecting values that prioritize protection of others over personal survival when circumstances demanded ultimate sacrifice in service of collective welfare. The tactical doctrine that governed military response to interdimensional invasion had been improvised from existing protocols for dealing with unconventional warfare and terrorist threats. The adaptation of established procedures to supernatural crisis, revealing both flexibility and limitations of institutional thinking that struggled to accommodate phenomena that exceeded every framework for understanding conflict and resistance that had been developed through centuries of purely earthly military experience. The coordination between military forces and civilian supernatural investigators required unprecedented cooperation between institutions that had never been designed to work together under circumstances that demanded integration of conventional and psychic capabilities. The command structures and communication protocols that emerged from this necessity, reflecting both human adaptability and the chaos that inevitably resulted when established systems were forced to accommodate variables that had never been included in planning assumptions. The logistics that supported military operations around the portal site included not only conventional supplies and equipment, but also specialized materials and protective gear that had been hastily developed through analysis of previous encounters with supernatural phenomena. The supply chains and maintenance procedures that kept defensive systems operational, revealing how quickly human organizations could adapt to impossible circumstances when survival depended upon innovation and improvisation rather than established procedure. The intelligence gathering that informed military decision-making during the crisis relied heavily upon information provided by civilian investigators whose understanding of supernatural phenomena exceeded official knowledge while remaining incomplete and theoretical in ways that made tactical planning extremely difficult. The integration of psychic insights with conventional reconnaissance, creating hybrid situational awareness that served immediate needs while revealing larger gaps in human understanding of cosmic threats. The evacuation procedures that had been developed for protecting civilian populations during supernatural emergencies reflected lessons learned through previous crises, while acknowledging that interdimensional invasion represented escalation of threat levels that exceeded all previous planning assumptions. The transportation networks and shelter systems that had been prepared for local supernatural incidents proving inadequate for cosmic-scale disaster that threatened not only immediate area, but potentially all human civilization. The medical facilities that had been established to treat casualties resulting from supernatural combat included specialized equipment and treatment protocols that had been developed through analysis of previous injuries caused by interdimensional entities. The trauma centers and field hospitals that served wounded personnel, revealing both human dedication to preserving life under impossible circumstances and the limitations of earthly medicine when confronting damage that extended beyond physical harm to include psychological and spiritual wounds. The sacrifice that military personnel were prepared to make during humanity's final stand against cosmic invasion represented more than simple courage under fire, to encompass willingness to face annihilation in service of values that gave meaning to existence even when survival seemed impossible. Their dedication to protecting others, despite hopeless odds, demonstrating qualities that distinguished human consciousness from purely self-interested intelligence and created foundations for resistance that transcended individual capability or institutional resources. The legacy that would survive regardless of military success or failure in conventional terms included example of ordinary people choosing to stand against cosmic horror despite overwhelming disadvantage, their willingness to fight impossible battles, serving as testimony to human values that recognized obligations that extended beyond personal survival to encompass protection of innocence and preservation of love and beauty that made existence meaningful for beings whose consciousness had evolved to embrace rather than destroy everything precious about reality. The final moments when military resistance would either contribute to ultimate victory or be swept aside by forces that exceeded all human capability for opposition represented culmination of centuries of military evolution and institutional development that had prepared humanity for every conceivable threat except cosmic predation by intelligences whose capabilities and motivations operated according to principles that transcended earthly understanding of conflict and survival, while demanding responses that combined conventional courage with supernatural intervention in ways that had never before been attempted or imagined possible. And so we close this gentle exploration of mysteries that shimmer like starlight in the darkness of uncertainty, each unanswered question a lullaby that carries us deeper into peaceful contemplation of wonders that exist beyond the reach of simple explanation. The friends of Hawkins, bound by love that transcends cosmic horror, remind us that some truths are more beautiful when they remain wrapped in the soft gauze of mystery rather than exposed to harsh light of complete understanding. Whether Vecna finds redemption or destruction, whether portals open to salvation or catastrophe, whether children wake from nightmare comas or sleep in healing dreams, the bonds of friendship persist through every uncertainty like gentle music that soothes troubled hearts. Rest now in the knowledge that love creates its own answers to questions that may never be resolved through words or revelation, that courage flourishes most beautifully in spaces where outcomes remain unknown, and that hope requires no proof beyond the willingness of ordinary people to protect what they cherish most. Sweet dreams from Hawkins, where every mystery becomes a doorway to wonder, and every unanswered question whispers the same eternal truth, that connection conquers fear, friendship transcends understanding, and love persists beyond all cosmic uncertainty into peaceful slumber, where all stories find their gentle resolution.